and welcome to the Confusion to Clarity podcast. This podcast is for anybody who needs that reminder that they really are capable of achieving amazing things. Each week we will be diving deep into all things mindset, manifestation and spirituality. Hosted by me, Natalie, a clinical hypnotherapist, psychotherapist, coach, mum and lover of all things mindset and manifestation. When listening, I want to give you a break from reality. I'm going to share with you the tools and techniques that you need to make your goals reality so you can stop playing small. Hello and welcome back to the Confusion to Clarity podcast. I hope you are all well and have had an amazing week. Although, little secret, it's probably been about 3 weeks since I recorded an episode. I batch recorded some because I took last week off, which was amazing. But when I've not recorded for a while, I always forget literally how to speak. I've restarted this about 10 times already, forget what to press and how to do it. So I'm figuring it out as I'm yapping right now. But yes, I hope you are all well, and if you are in the start of the summer holidays, they've started positively for you. As I said, I was off last week, which was so nice, although it was a really busy week off. It wasn't a relaxing sit by the pool holiday. So although beautiful, gorgeous, I have come back and had to hit the ground running, which is always pretty intense. But one of the things I always think about when I travel is hypnotherapy, which might make sense because it's my business and my job and I do think about it a lot. But as I've shared on social media and on the podcast before, I've used hypnotherapy myself personally in so many different areas of my life. And it always blows my mind how it works. But one of the biggest areas that I used it was for my fear of flying. I think I've spoken about this before. I can't remember. I'm going to talk about it again. But my fear of flying was bad. Like it was a really big fear of flying, to the point where I had to take medication to fly or would drink alcohol, quite a bit of alcohol. Obviously not the medication and alcohol together, that would be a bad combo. But I had to literally do anything to really calm myself down just to even get on the plane. And it was that bad on one occasion. This is actually quite embarrassing, but I got to check in and I didn't say anything, but my demeanor, my whole facial expressions probably conveyed how I felt. And the check-in agent said to me, are you okay? And I was like, no, I've got a really big fear of flying. And she wasn't empathetic and nice. She got really shitty of me. And I get why. But she was like, right, are you going to get on the plane? And I said, no, I will get on. I have coping strategies, but I just really hate it. It terrifies me. And she's like, well, now you said that, we're not going to load your bag until we know you're on the plane. I was like, how embarrassing. I was like, no, I will get on. She's like, no, until we know you're on that plane, we're not loading your bag. So then not only did I have a fear of flying, I also then had a fear of, oh my God, what if they forget my bag? And then I end up, I can't remember where I was going, with no clothes. That would be awful. And yeah, they refused to load my bag. So I got to the gate and I could see them loading the bags on to the hold. I could see my bag sat on the tarmac. And I was like, no, there's my bag. And this ground handling agent saw me intently staring out the window, and he just stopped and was like, you okay? So I explained, and he was like, look, you go get yourself on the plane. I will personally make sure they load your bag. And true to his word, they did load my bag. It met me at the other end. And I get why, because obviously if somebody refuses to fly, they've loaded your bags. It can often be really hard to relocate bags. And then obviously delays cost airlines huge amounts of money. So I get why. But equally, yeah, it was pretty embarrassing. And it was awful, honestly, from the moment I booked a flight. And once I got on the plane, I was just a sweating, shaking mess. And God forbid there was turbulence or the seatbelt sign went on, I would literally be white knuckle gripping hold of the seat, scanning the cabin for the Grim Reaper. It's like the end is nigh. It was bad. As I said. And then when I did my hypnotherapy training, we had a module on phobias and fears. So one of the women I was training with, she's like, right, well, we'll do your fear of flying. And then I worked on her claustrophobia. And she had really intense claustrophobia, would not go into confined spaces, would not go on the underground. She would have to walk miles, get a taxi, get a bus. So we actually got rid of her claustrophobia. Actually, she'll now go on the underground no problems at all. And similarly, she got rid of my fear of flying. So it's about looking at where these phobias came from. And I was able to identify where it originated from. And often with a lot of flying, it's not just the technicalities of flying, it's what it represents, like a loss of control. You are trusting somebody else with your safety, and that's a big thing. So yeah, we went back in, we did a couple of sessions, and honestly, it blows my mind how it works. So from my training to now, I've probably done about 15 flights, and it's bizarre. I can remember how I felt, and like I said, it was an intense fear, but you can't bring the emotion up. So I'm like, I can remember, but then it's almost detached from my physical body. So I remember that at a certain point, certainly when, they'd push back from the stand, my stomach would be literally in my mouth. Now, it's just this feeling of neutrality. I'm not saying I have, secret desires now to retrain as a pilot. Absolutely not. But it's just a means of me getting from one place to another. And it's as if somebody's removed that emotion, which essentially is what we do when we use hypnosis. We can't erase your memory, sadly, but we can take the emotion out, because it's the emotion that obviously keeps that fear alive. And yeah, it's just this neutral feeling. And the flight I most recently took was probably the most turbulent flight I've taken in years, certainly probably the last like 20 years. We took off for a storm, so it was really bumpy, and we had to climb really steeply to try and get above the storm. So it was like really steep incline as we took off, and then really bumping around. And yeah, I just sat there reading my book, just not bothered at all. So yeah, honestly, it blows my mind, because I get people regularly say to me, well, does it actually work? And it always really like baffles me when people say that. We're like, yes, of course it works. What do you think, I would do something that actually is just like not real? Like, yeah, you've got to want to make the changes, but it blows my mind. So anyway, that's a waffly little intro of my fear of flying, or former fear of flying. So yeah, if you have a fear or phobia, come and speak to me. You don't have to suffer with it. It is possible to regain that control. So anyway, that's my update of the week. Obviously, we're now into the summer holidays, so it's the whole juggling slash chauffeuring everybody around. But it is quite nice not to have that real intense busy morning with school runs. So I'm actually really grateful for that. It is nice to have a break and just have a bit of a slower start, ready for September, because my September, everything's changing again. So yeah, enjoying the break while it is here. But anyway, enough waffling and yapping about flying. I want to get into this week's episode. This is an episode I've had on my ideas list for a very, very long time. It's something personally that I relate to, and I feel like so many of you are going to relate to it as well, because it comes up so frequently in sessions, and it's all around hindsight. So when we say to ourselves, but how did I let that happen? Because the version that you've become today, the woman you are today, probably wouldn't have tolerated, allowed the situations, events of the past to happen, or to happen in the way that they did. So when this comes up in the therapy room, it can often bring up a lot of grief, a lot of trauma, and a lot of frustration to the self of like, well, how? And I think it's very easy to look back in that way, because hindsight, let's be honest, has 20/20 vision. If we all had hindsight, we'd all be in very different places right now, but we're not. So I wanted to dive into this topic because, as I said, it's a real area that so many women beat themselves up over. So I've made some notes to stay on track and hopefully keep this episode under 30 minutes. That's always my aim, but they always go over. So, as I said, this episode is looking back at the earlier version of yourself and thinking, why did I stay? Why did I put up with that? Why didn't I speak up? Why didn't I trust myself? Like, those things that were happening were so flippin' obvious. Maybe this is in relation to a relationship you were in, a partnership. Maybe it's a friendship. That can be a big one for a lot of women. Or perhaps it's a job. Jobs, again, big areas where we stay for far longer than we should. But as is often the case, we get through those times. Maybe you've had therapy, you've healed, you've grown, you've evolved. And Now, when you reflect back and you think about that time, everything seems so glaringly obvious. You were sat there thinking, how? Like, how did I miss that? And that's when the self kind of like deprecating talk can come in, that whole shoulda, woulda, coulda. But the key thing to acknowledge to yourself here is the version of you looking back today has the knowledge, has the experience, and the awareness that the you of then did not have. So, the question I want you to ask yourself today is, what do you understand now that the woman you were back then couldn't have known? Because so many of us look back at previous versions of ourselves with, as I touched on, anger, embarrassment, regret, and we criticize her, we blame her, we feel ashamed at times, but we have to get to a point where we say, is criticizing her serving me, or is it keeping me stuck in patterns of the past? Perhaps now is the time that younger version of you needs to finally be understood. The version you are now needs to understand that younger version of you. So, what do we mean by that? When you know how something ends, it can feel as though you should have always known this. Like, oh my God, as I said, so obvious. Once somebody has repeatedly shown you who they are, you might look back and think, how did I not see that? This was, I had a client last year, and she had started seeing a guy. She'd been single for a while. She'd come out of a very traumatic relationship, and she'd been doing some healing work. She was in a better place. So she came to work with me after this event, and she met a guy, and he swept her off of her feet, seemed to be the answer to all of the things she was looking for. And it became very intense very quickly. Now, she acknowledges, looking back, that at the time when she met this guy, there was always that niggle in her stomach, like, oh God, he's quite intense. This is quite a lot too soon. But she said she gaslit herself because she'd never had this adoration before, because she'd never had the, this attention on her before. She was thinking, well, maybe it's just because I'm not used to it. Maybe that's why. So she ignored the gut feelings and she continued in this new relationship. And after about 8 weeks, she said the shoe dropped. This guy went from being loving, intense, kind to really cold and distant. But obviously, by that point, chemically, she was hooked. And she had to really work hard to get out of that situation because her brain was saying, but he was so nice. And he seemed so genuine. And I really thought I'd found the one. And now I'm sitting here going, what the hell was that all about? And it really derailed her. So she came to work with me kind of just as she'd managed to get out of that situation. And there were a lot of sessions where she was really beating herself up. I should have seen it. Like my gut was telling me and I ignored my gut. But like I've said, hindsight has 20/20 vision. The version of the client that I was working with at the time, at the time she was in that new relationship, she didn't have this insight. She didn't know that it was love bombing. She didn't know that, this wasn't healthy or right. And, as I was saying to her at the time, she had no idea of knowing what moments would become the patterns and, where those red flags would become really glaringly bright red and waving. But it's not just in romantic relationships that this can happen. Sometimes you might have a niggle that something's not right, but you have a belief in your being that says conflict feels frightening, so you don't want to stand up up to that person or advocate for yourself. But the version you've become now would be like, absolutely not. If something's not right, then I'm going to say that and I'm going to address it. I'm not going to sit there and take it. Maybe the version of you who was going through a specific event didn't want to disappoint somebody or let somebody down, so they swallowed that feeling of sadness, frustration, rather than say something and risk disappointing or being kind of targeted. Feeling responsible for everybody is another big one of why we tolerate situations. I don't want to say anything because I feel responsible for their happiness or their well-being. Or the case of, relationships, once you do leave a relationship or a job, for example, or even a friendship, and you're, reflecting back retrospectively, it's easy to look back now and say, I should have left sooner. But when you're in the thick of something, leaving is change. And as you know, if you're a regular listener of the podcast, our subconscious doesn't like change. It likes familiarity. It takes that familiar hell over an unfamiliar heaven. So intellectually, you probably knew that this wasn't the right dynamic to be in. You probably knew deep down you needed to get out. But the thought of getting out and what was on the other side was more terrifying than staying put. So when you're critiquing that past version of yourself, you're essentially asking her to have possessed wisdom that was created through the very experiences that you're now judging her for. So just diving deeper into, why are we so harsh on that version of ourselves? Because hindsight creates the illusion that the answer was obvious. From where you're standing now, you can see the whole picture. But when you're in that situation, you can only see the small part, the immediate part that's directly in front of you. And she was making decisions using the information, the knowledge that she had at that time. She was making decisions based on what she was taught was normal. And again, this is a big thing, like the conditioning, the upbringing that we have sets the tone for what we tolerate and don't tolerate. So maybe the blueprint that she was running from was telling her that this is okay or this is normal, or it was making her believe that she was too much, that she was a problem. And maybe she believed speaking out and saying her truth risked her being rejected. And again, if you're a regular listener of the podcast, our subconscious likes to know we're safe. It wants to be part of a tribe, which is why if you were in primitive times, you wouldn't go out hunting by yourself because you'd be more at risk of being attacked. We're better in a crowd. And that's the confusing part in our brain, because you could be in a situation where you're like, people are not my tribe. This is not the tribe I should be sitting in. But your subconscious is saying, okay, I hear that, but if you leave your tribe and you go off by yourself, what's going to happen to you? The job of your subconscious is to keep you safe, alive, and well. So if your brain is thinking, okay, we don't want to be in this tribe, but if we leave, we could die, it's better to stay where we are than risk going off hunting by ourselves. And our subconscious, if it's trying to keep us safe and familiar, can sometimes act like that little devil on your shoulder. You have an intellectual thought that says, I need to get out of this situation. I need to leave this relationship. I need to leave this job. I need to end this friendship. And then that little devil on your shoulder pipes up with, yeah, but what if you leave and you regret it? Or what if you do leave and you start again and it doesn't work? Or you leave and then what, you've wasted all of these years that you've invested into this job and all these promotions, and now you're just going to walk away. There's a feeling of being judged, a fear of being judged even, which is a massive fear. We might say, okay, I don't really care what people think, but ultimately we do care, because it is all linking back to that fear of being ostracized from the tribe. If you have a different opinion and people are disagreeing with you, your brain's going to construe that as, well, I'm being kicked out of the tribe, I'm not safe. So when we look back at this, when we're talking about giving that younger self compassion, this is exactly what we mean. Because the version of you back then, she wasn't necessarily weak. She might have been frightened. She might have been exhausted and in survival mode. And she was trying to keep the peace in order to keep safety, in her life. And maybe she was desperately trying to keep a situation going, to fix things, because the alternative felt too enormous, too overbearing to even comprehend. And another factor I see a lot in clients and personally relate to as well, there's often a part of us that deep down believes that if we explain ourselves more clearly, if we try it a little bit harder, if we become easier to love or we ask for less, then maybe eventually things will change. And I see that a lot, specifically in romantic relationships. A lot of my clients come to me who are either not happy in relationships or have just left relationships, and they'll say, but I just stopped asking, or I just swallowed it down every time I felt frustrated. I tried to not be as needy. I tried to ask for less. I tried to be more self-sufficient, because they were believing that if they would just less and just kind of not as noticeable and we're under the radar, or if they did try and explain enough, then that person that they were trying to explain to might turn around and say, oh yeah, now I see that. I get your point now. Another point here is to understand that understanding is not the same as excusing. So meeting your past self with compassion doesn't mean pretending that every choice she made was healthy. It doesn't mean denying the ways that you may have abandoned yourself. Sometimes healing does involve honestly acknowledging and saying to yourself things like, I did ignore my own needs. I did override my intuition. I did remain quiet when I should have spoken up. And I did keep accepting things that were actually really hurtful. And maybe there are times that you did betray yourself, but that was done as a way of preserving a relationship, to avoid conflict, or to protect somebody else's comfort, which is a big thing. So when we acknowledge this to ourselves, it can be incredibly painful, but it doesn't need to become more evidence to use against yourself. That's the key thing, because you can take responsibility without punishing yourself. You can say to yourself, I understand why I did that, but I don't want to do that anymore. Because both things can be true. You can have compassion, but that compassion doesn't mean that it's necessarily about removing responsibility. What we're doing, it's about creating enough emotional safety to look honestly at what happened, to learn from those experiences, to make peace with the past, and choose differently now. Because shame usually keeps us trapped. Understanding creates movement. So, what would it mean to you to acknowledge that past version of yourself? So, I want you to try this now as an exercise. So, if you're driving, operating heavy machinery, or just not in a place where you can sit quietly, don't do this now. Pause it, come back to it. But if you are in a space where you can safely close your eyes and just listen for a second and try this exercise, do so, follow along. If not, come back. So close your eyes and I want you to think about a particular version of yourself. Perhaps it's you from 5 years ago who was in a certain relationship, 10 years ago in a certain job, maybe even 20 years ago if you're a similar age to me. Perhaps it's the version of you who stayed in a situation. Maybe it's the version of you who left a situation. The person who went back. Going back creates a lot of shame for a lot of people. The woman who kept trying, the woman who was frightened of failing, and the woman who didn't know who she was without everybody else. So instead of asking, "Oh, what was wrong with me?" try asking, what was I afraid would happen? What was I trying to protect? What did I believe I had to do to be loved? What had I normalized? And then a really big question, what didn't I understand yet? And then the final question, what support, knowledge, or confidence did I not have at that time? Because these questions will lead somewhere very different. They move us away from judgment and towards understanding. So, following on from that, I want you to also try this exercise. So, if you can, keep your eyes closed. And if you can't close your eyes, you can just keep listening and come back to this, as I said, at a time when you can, participate, close your eyes. So, with your eyes closed, just focus on your breathing for me for a few seconds. So, breathing in through your nose and just exhaling out through your mouth. You don't need to force yourself to relax now. Just allow yourself to be here. And I want you to start by imagining an earlier version of yourself. Now, you don't need to choose the most painful moment of your life. You can allow whichever version of you needs to receive some support and attention today. Now, when you have this version of you in your mind, I want you to notice, how old is she? Where is she? Notice what she's wearing. I want you to look at the expression on her face. And rather than standing over her as the woman who knows better, I want you to imagine sitting beside her. Because you're not there to lecture her. You're not there to tell her everything she did wrong and critique her. You are sat there simply to understand. So you might ask her, what are you frightened of? What do you think will happen if you choose yourself? And then just listen to her answer. You might hear her saying, I understand now what you couldn't have known then. And then I want you to imagine saying to her things such as, I understand now why you couldn't have known that back then. I understand now why you were scared. I understand why you kept trying. I understand why the future felt so uncertain. And I'm sorry for all the times I've looked back and judged you. You were making decisions with the awareness and the resources that you had at the time. You were not stupid. You were not pathetic. You were trying to feel safe. You were trying to be loved. You were trying to survive something that you didn't fully understand yet. And then perhaps tell her what you know now. Perhaps you could reassure her that the responsibility was never hers. Perhaps you could tell her that she didn't need to earn love by disappearing. Perhaps you could tell her that other people's disappointment did not mean that she had done something wrong. Perhaps you could tell her that setting a boundary didn't make her cruel. Perhaps you could tell her that she didn't need to silence herself, that it was safe to advocate, to share her voice. Or perhaps you could help her see that starting again doesn't mean failure. And then I want you to tell her the future her has eventually become stronger, wiser, and more self aware because of the experiences that she has gone through. And perhaps you could finish by saying, thank you for getting me here. I don't need you to keep protecting me in the same way. I can make the choices now. I'm listening to us now. Then I want you to take another breath and just slowly exhale. And when you feel ready, just gently open your eyes. Now, if now you're crying, I apologize for making you cry, but this is a really powerful technique, and you can come back and repeat the process with different memories as and when they come up. And it's all about making peace with the past, because as we touched on there, it's the version of you that had all these experiences that is running the show today, not because she's intentionally being a control freak, but because she's trying to regain that familiarity and safety. So when you say to her, like, thank you, but you can step down now, you give permission and make peace with the past and begin the process of integrating the version of you that you've now become. A really effective technique here to use also on specific memories is the Ho'oponopono technique. So if you haven't heard of that, it's a Hawaiian forgiveness technique. It is so effective. I think I've done 2 episodes on this. I'll link them below. And there's a mantra that you say to yourself. And I think the key thing to always stress when we talk about forgiveness is we're not okaying the past. We're not condoning somebody's bad behavior, but we're allowing ourselves to make peace with how it made us feel and what we took from it that isn't ours to hold on to. So we can let go of any misunderstandings, any false beliefs, anything that's no longer serving us, so we can start to move forwards feeling the most empowered versions of ourselves and using those experiences to our highest advantage, as opposed to keeping us overprotected and stuck. Another technique that I really love is to write a letter to your past self. Now, this can be really, really effective. So you'd start it with, like, Dear me at 35, Dear me in 2007, or just even Dear younger me. And then you write, I understand now then you write what you understand now. You reaffirm to her, you couldn't have known, insert reasonings. I'm sorry I judged you for. I understand that you were frightened of. I know you were trying to. What happened was not all your fault. What I wish somebody had told you was, thank you for. Because of what you survived, I now understand. From this point forward, I promise to. You don't have to write a perfect letter. It doesn't need to sound really profound and deep. It just needs to be honest. And again, you might feel really sad writing this. Like when I was writing the notes for this, I kind of could feel myself welling up a little bit. You might feel anger. That's another one, because again, here, a lot of this is triggering shame and grief. And with grief, obviously, we have the grief cycle, which has different emotions within it. And one of those emotions is anger, that, oh my gosh, I feel so angry at the past. How did I let that happen? And if that hadn't have happened, then this wouldn't have happened. And it can really bring up a real rage. And maybe, or you might feel like super protective of that younger you. When you're doing this, emotions are our guidance system. So rather than pushing it down and suppressing it, sit with it. Sit with the feeling. Where do I feel it in my body? What is it telling me? And this is where I love doing EFT, the emotional freedom technique, and tapping out the emotion. That's something I do with my clients when we're working on this in sessions. Acknowledging how you feel, but then beginning the process of transmuting it and letting that anger, the unwanted emotion, pass. I always describe it a bit like a wave. It comes in, comes crashing down, and then it recedes again. Also, another point here, which I think is really, really important to mention, is you might be at a stage where you also realize that you're not ready to forgive every choice you made. And that's okay too. That doesn't mean you're hanging on to resentment. It just sometimes takes longer to process certain things. Or, again, said on the podcast, I say it all the time with clients, healing isn't linear. And actually, you might sometimes clear a certain memory a number of times. And that could be because there are so many different emotions attached to that memory. So you might go in and clear that memory on one occasion and you release the anger, but then that anger subsides and it allows a feeling of shame or sadness to come up. So it's about being gentle and kind with yourself and understanding that it's a gradual process. But the most important thing is choosing not to speak to yourself with that really harsh, critical, cruel tone. And again, I really want to reiterate here, making peace does not mean approving of everything. Making peace with the past doesn't mean saying that everything happened for a reason, which I know is a saying, and I know a lot of us take comfort in that saying, but it can also be a kind of like a bit toxically positive as well. Like, everything happens for a reason, everything I learn from, and you do. But again, don't use that as a kind of a stick to beat yourself with. And also, it certainly does not mean that what happened was acceptable. And again, a big thing with healing and forgiving, we're not saying that somebody else's behavior was justifiable, that it was okay, and it was just who they were. But it's about acknowledging to yourself that right now you can't time travel back and give her the knowledge that you now have today. But what you can do is to stop punishing her for not having that knowledge. You can honor what she's taught you. You can notice the places where you abandoned yourself without abandoning yourself again through shame. You can allow regret to become information rather than a life sentence. And perhaps, you wish you had left sooner. Perhaps you wish you had spoken up. Perhaps you wish you had trusted yourself sooner. But again, the theme through this episode, hindsight is a wonderful thing. The most important question now is not what didn't I know then? It's reframed into what will I do with what I know now? Because this is where self-trust is rebuilt. Not by never making another mistake. We're human. We're going to make mistakes. Even when we've learnt lessons, like that's just life. But it's by teaching yourself, by showing yourself that I will listen when something feels wrong. I will trust my gut. And this goes into, quietening the mind, and why things like meditation, journaling is so powerful, because anxiety is all about that living in the future, what if, or introspecting the past, as we're talking about today, the shoulda, woulda, coulda. And it's about bringing yourself into the present moment, because that's the only moment we actually have. And when we do that, when we bring ourselves into the present, that's when we can really connect into our gut, into our inner being. We get those intuitive downloads, our mind is calmer, and we can listen. Because interestingly, I always say this to clients, that anxious voice always sounds really like panicky and like naggy and niggly, whereas your inner knowing always sounds very calm and very intuitive and level. But it's really hard to differentiate between those two voices when you're so anxious, when you're introspecting the past, when you're negatively forecasting the future. And I think part of making peace with it is coming to the realization that you can be frightened of the future, but you can still move towards it. And again, this is where things like nervous system regulation comes in. I talk about it every episode, but it genuinely is so important. If you're in a phase of life where you're healing, transmuting feelings of the past, making peace with the past, understanding yourself at that deep intrinsic level, and moving yourself forwards, as again we've been saying, that's daunting and scary. Your subconscious doesn't like change. So regulating your nervous system, again, is anchoring you back into the present of, I'm safe. I don't know every step along my next, this new journey, this new path I'm taking, but I'm trusting myself and I'm allowing myself to take one step calmly at a time. So I really hope this episode has resonated. And I want to round off the episode by just going back to the first question that I asked. So, what do you understand now that the woman you were back then couldn't have known? So, perhaps she couldn't have known that love should not require her to disappear. Perhaps she couldn't have known that anxiety wasn't proof that she was making the wrong decision. Perhaps she couldn't have known that keeping everybody else happy would eventually cost her her relationship with herself. Perhaps she couldn't have known that failure was not the ending she imagined it to be. And I think the biggest one, and when I wrote this down, it made me feel really choked. So I apologise if it does to you too. But it's perhaps she couldn't have known that one day she would become the woman she needed back then. That got me. So I'm sorry if you're now welling up too. I think it's a really powerful realization, because you don't have to keep fighting the person you used to be. You can acknowledge, as I said, where she abandoned herself. You can learn from the decisions she made, and you can still choose to meet her with compassion, because, again, she didn't know what you know now, but you do. And that means that you get to choose what happens next. So, this was quite a deep episode today. I felt quite emotional recording it, and I felt really emotional when I was writing my notes out as well. So, maybe take some time to go back over and revisit these exercises if it's resonated. And even if it's not maybe resonated on a real deep intrinsic level, maybe it's just about taking some time to just thank the past version of you for everything she has done that's enabled you to become the woman that you are today. And start speaking to yourself more kindly and with more compassion, because I think so many of us are guilty of speaking to ourselves so harshly, aren't we? And we're doing the best we can. Like that's the I say this to my clients all the time, like, we're doing the best we can, and nobody can ask for any more than that. In work, in love, in motherhood, we have a lot of pressure on our shoulders. And again, if you have practiced any of the exercises I shared today, remember to regulate your nervous system after, bring yourself back to the present moment, calm, peaceful state. I'll link those episodes below. And yeah, I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you found that it resonated, that you found it useful. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out. If you go into the show notes, at the very top it says send, I think it says send fan mail. Sounds a bit obnoxious, but it will send a message directly to my phone from the platforms, whatever platform you're listening on. Also in the show notes are all of my social media. I forgot the word. Brain fog. Social media details, I was trying to say. All my social media details are there, so you can reach out and follow me, and all the other links that you might need. And if, of course, you want to work with me, reach out. There's lots of different ways that you can do that, and I always love speaking to you. So yeah, if you've enjoyed this episode, also don't forget to share it with somebody else who you feel might benefit from it too. And again, I say every week, but if you haven't, please leave a review. It really helps me to get the podcast out to even more people. So have a wonderful week, be kind to yourself, and I look forward to speaking to you soon. Take care.